it's Miss Malstead, and today we are going to do the Rainbow Volume Lab together. Now, if you're at home and you don't have the materials, that's okay. You can follow along with me and use the data that I collect during my experiment as the data for your own lab experiment. If you're at home but you want to try this lab but you don't have the right materials, I would encourage you to watch the video so that way you can learn how to use things such as the graduated cylinder, take a look at beakers, and also take a look at the test tubes, because everything I do is going to be measured in metric. But if you want to try to recreate this at home, it's super simple. The only thing that you won't be able to substitute for something else will be the colors we're using today. So you're going to want to have blue, red, and yellow food coloring. Without these, you're not going to get the right results. Those are the only things you can't substitute. Now, if you don't have test tubes at home or beakers or graduated cylinders, you can substitute all of these materials for a couple things that you probably do have at home. Instead of test tubes and beakers, you can use clear cups, whether they're glass, plastic, throwaway cups, maybe even some Tupperware at your home. You just want to be able to see through the material so you can see what's happening to the colors inside. And instead of using a graduated cylinder to help you guys do your measurements, you can do your measurements using something you probably have at home, such as measuring spoons. Now, the only thing you're going to have to remember is, instead of saying measuring your things in milliliters, you're going to want to do it in either tablespoons or teaspoons. So for step 1 in our experiment, it calls for 19 milliliters of red water to go into one of the test tubes. So you're going to do 19 tablespoons or 19 teaspoons of red water into your clear container. So that's how you can do it at home. Like I said, it would be great if you guys would stick around, watch how to use the graduated cylinder, use the materials that we are going to use in science class before you go off and do it on your own. Now, the first thing you're going to have to do, and I already have some, is you're going to need to get some glasses of water. These all have about the same amount of water in them. It doesn't matter how much you have. If you're going to use tablespoons, you're probably going to need about 30 tablespoons of water in each cup before you add in your dye. Now I'm going to start with my red, and I'm going to put my red in this guy. And you only need a couple drops in each. You don't need to go too crazy with your colors. And be careful, because the dye will stain your fingers or your clothes or your counters. So make sure that it is okay with an adult before you do this at home. So I already got some on my hands, so I'm going to grab a paper towel. And I still need yellow. So I'm going to dip or pour my yellow in. And I have less water in that one, so I'm going to add a few less drops. Finally, I'm just going to give them all a stir. Make sure I get the color distributed throughout all the water. Perfect. Now we are ready to do some measuring. So with my lab, I always like to follow through my procedure step by step, and I like to check them off as I do it. So if you're looking at your lab report, the first thing says that we're going to pour 19 milliliters of red water into test tube A, which I have listed here. Now, my graduated cylinder only holds 10 milliliters of water at a time, so I'm going to want to add 10 in first, and then I'll have to go back and get that final 9. Now, I am going to pause here and flip the video around so you guys can see what I see, an up-close view of the graduated cylinder. All right, so I have my graduated cylinder set up. So for step 1, it says into test tube A, I need to add that 19 milliliters of red water. So I'm going to grab my red beaker. And so remember, I said that I'm going to have to add 10 milliliters first and then go back and do the last 9. So I'm going to look for my 10 milliliters here on my graduated cylinder. And with a very, very careful hand, I'm going to start pouring my water from my beaker. Now, in science, it's really important that we try to get as exact as possible. So I'm going to try to slow down. And if I look, I'm just a tiny bit past the 10. So I'm just going to try to dump out a few drops back into my beaker so I can be as precise as possible. Much better, much closer to that 10 line. And once my meniscus settles down, it looks like I'm right on that line. So I'm going to add that in to test tube A. Now I have to go back and add that last 9 so I can get that 19. So I'm going to fill it up to the 9. And again, once I get close, I'm going to try to slow it down just a little bit. And again, if I look, I can see that I definitely went over that time. So it's okay if it takes you a couple tries to get the right amount. Now I'm going to bend down and take a look, and my meniscus, if I'm looking close enough, is going to hit right about at that 9. So I'm going to go ahead and add that into test tube A. So that was step 1. So like I said, I like to cross it off on my procedure list. If we're reading step 2, it now says into test tube C. So we're going to skip over B and go to C. We're going to add 18 milliliters of yellow water. So I'm going to add from my yellow beaker right into my graduated cylinder again. I'm not going to rinse out. If you're doing it at home, you can feel free to rinse out your beaker. The color shouldn't make too much of a difference in here. So it said 18 milliliters. So again, I'm going to fill up to that 10 mark first. Going fast and then trying to slow down as I get closer. And if I look, I'm just a little short, so I'm going to try to add just a few more drops of water. I'm going to bend down, and my meniscus is hitting right at that 10, so I can go ahead and put that into test tube C. And then I need to add 8 more milliliters, so just a little bit less than I did for the red. I'm going to bend down and take a look, and I am right at that 8 mark. So I'm going to add that in to test tube C. So we finished another step. Now, step number 3 says into test tube E, so I'm going to skip over D and go to E. I'm going to add 18 milliliters of blue water. So I'm going to switch out my beakers, get my blue water, and I'm going to add that into my graduated cylinder. Again, go up to 10 first. And this is going to be a little harder because the beaker is just a little bit bigger and harder to hold. And I went a little too far this time again. I went a little too fast. So I'm just going to drop out a couple drops, see if that helped me get down. And I am. I'm right at that 10 mark. So I'm going to pour that into test tube E. But to make it to 18, again, I need to add in up to that 8 mark. I'm going to bend down, take a look, and it looks like it's hitting right about at that 8 mark. And I'm going to set my blue water aside. So far we filled 3 out of our 6 test tubes with that main color. Now is when it's going to get tricky because we're going to start mixing some of these colors. So step 4 says from test tube C, which is my yellow, I want to take 4 milliliters of this water. So I'm gonna take some of the water out of here and try to pour it back into my graduated cylinder. Now I only wanna put 4 milliliters of water in here, so just a tiny little bit, so I need to move slow. So that's 3. I'm gonna try to shake out some of those bubbles and take a look. I'm right at that 4. So I'm gonna put my C back so I don't drop it, and I'm gonna pour that into test tube D, so right here in between. Now I'm gonna take some from my test tube E, and I'm gonna take 7 milliliters of that and add it into D. And as you can see, I'm already getting a little bit of a change. So when I add that blue water into test tube D, what color do you think I'm gonna make? Let's find out. So I'm gonna take test tube E, and I want 7 milliliters this time. So I'm gonna get a little bit more. And if you remember from art class, what happens, oops, way too much. So I went way too fast. I have to get rid of some of that. And it took too much. It sometimes takes a few tries. If you don't get it exactly, that's okay. Let's let that settle. I'm just gonna take about 2 drops out of here. I'm really, really close. Oh, that's much better. I'm much closer to that 7. So I'm gonna put my E here. And now I'm gonna pour this into test tube D. So when I pour this into D, we're gonna see a change. And so if I mix it up a little bit, when you take a look, and it might be a little bit harder for you guys to see, when I combined my yellow and my blue, I made a really dark green because I have a really dark blue. So that's what happened when we mixed those 2 colors. Let's see what else we can make. So from our beaker of blue water, or maybe you're using a cup of blue water, I want to take 4 milliliters and pour it into test tube F. So again, that's not that much water, so I'm gonna have to move slowly. And I went just a little far over, I can already see. So I'm, again, just gonna take a couple drops out. Oops, that was way too many drops. Let's try that again. I'm looking to hit that 4 milliliter mark. Let some of those bubbles settle. I'm gonna say that's about 4. There's just a couple bubbles in there. So I'm gonna pour that into test tube F. Now, because I can read ahead and I'm gonna be working with some red and yellow water, and I can see that my graduated cylinder is really blue, I'm actually gonna pause for a second and I'm gonna go rinse this out. So if you have yours and you're doing it and yours is really blue, I would suggest you rinse it out super quick, since we're all done with the blue water today. There we go. Now we aren't gonna get some of those things mixed up. All right, so I poured my blue water into test tube F. Now I'm gonna take water from my beaker of red water, and I'm gonna put 7 milliliters in here. So again, I'm gonna look for that 7 on here first so I know where I'm measuring to. And I'm going to carefully want some of those bubbles to settle. I'm gonna get down at eye level and it looks perfect. My meniscus is hitting right at the 7. So I'm gonna pour that into test tube F. But before I do that, what is gonna happen when I pour this red water in with the blue? Let's find out. I'm gonna mix that up a little bit. And for you guys at home, it probably looks way darker than it is. It almost probably looks black. But actually, for my house, it looks like a very deep purple or almost a violet color. Like a very deep purple, because when you mix red and blue water, we make the color purple. So let's move on to step number 8, which is taking stuff from test tube A, and we want 8 milliliters of that, and we're gonna put it into B. So I'm gonna take test tube A. I wanna get 8 milliliters, so I'm gonna fill up to that 8 millimeter mark. I'm gonna try, oops, I went way too fast there at the end. I'm already all the way up to 9, so I'm gonna take a few drops out. And let's see, too many that time. Moving from test tube into the, oops, graduated cylinder is really tricky. How many did I say? I want 8, so I still have a little ways to go. And I just really need a couple drops. I'm gonna try to be as careful as I can. And I went too far again. My dog hit me with his tail. Still at 9, so a few more drops. Little more. And I'm trying to be careful not to spill and get it all back in the test tube. I am right almost at 8, so I am going to leave that, put A back, and I'm going to pour this into test tube B. And we're going to make one more adjustment to our amounts. We're going to take a little bit from test tube C. We're only going to take 3 milliliters, so really just a tiny amount of water from test tube C to pour it into test tube B. And then we'll be all done mixing the colors. It's almost at 2, so I'm going to try to go slow. And again, it's all about balance. So I'm going to take a couple drops out of here. So if you're getting frustrated, I would suggest just taking a little break in between pouring, because sometimes it can get a little difficult, especially when you're measuring little amounts. And this is what our Rainbow Lab is really all about today, is measuring out small amounts of liquid to get some practice. Still a little more, guys. Perfect. So I'm right about at that 3 mark. So I'm gonna dump from here into test tube B. But before I do that, what happens when I mix red and yellow? Let's find out. Because my red is a little bit darker, you might be able to tell at home that's more of an orange color, because when we mix red and yellow, we get an orange. So if we back up, it's almost like we made a rainbow using just those 3 primary colors. So our last step is we just need to figure out how much volume of water is in each test tube. But before that, I want you guys to pause the video and go through and fill in the color that's in each test tube. So from test tube A, what color is in there? So pause the video and do that. All right, so the final part of our experiment for today is we need to figure out how much water is left in each test tube. And so we're gonna measure that, of course, using our handy dandy graduated cylinder. Now, if you're at home, you might be using a tablespoon or a teaspoon to help measure, and you're just gonna wanna have a dump cup a blank cup that you can dump your water into as you're measuring. So let's get started. So again, we only measure up to 10 milliliters in here, so I'm not quite sure. I might need to dump it out before I can finish adding it up. So I'm gonna start with test tube A, and I'm gonna slowly pour in to try to hit that 10 milliliter mark. And I went just a little over, so I'm gonna pour just a couple drops out back into my test tube so I can get an accurate reading of how much water is in here. It's just that's about a tenth of a milliliter left. So I'm gonna remember, and I'm just gonna write it down that that's 9.9 milliliters in there, and I'm gonna dump it into my dump because I have a little bit left in my test tube. So I can just pour the rest of this in here and figure out the amount once it's in. So now that that's empty, I'm gonna get down and I can see it's at 1, and each of these dash marks is a tenth. So I have 1.1, 1.2, 3, 4, 5. So I have 1.5 milliliters in there. So if I take the 9.9 plus 1.5, that gives me 11.4 milliliters. So there was 11.4 milliliters in test tube A. So now I'm gonna dump all that out, shake it out into my thing, and put it back. Now let's move on to B. Again, I want to try to stop as I hit that 10 milliliter mark, because going past it, I won't know how much is in there. Like one more dot. I'm gonna get down and read my meniscus. That's just a smidge over. I'm gonna call that 10.1, guys. So I'm gonna dump that into my dump bin. So if I have 10.1, I'm gonna dump just the little bit that's left and empty it out. And I'm gonna get down and read it. And I am at 1.1. So 10.1 plus 1.1 gives me 11.2 milliliters. So there's 11.2 milliliters in my orange test tube. Let's move on to yellow. So again, I'm looking for that 10 mark. And I'm gonna get down, and that is exactly 10. So I can pour that in and just finish testing the rest. So I'm gonna pop that right in. I'm gonna get down and read it. I have 1, 1.1, and 1.2. So 10 plus 1.2 gives me 11.2 milliliters. So there is 11.2 milliliters in test tube C. All right, moving on to D. Now, if you're doing this at home, these are the colors you want to be careful not to get on mom or dad's counter or on your clothes. So that's exactly 10 milliliters. I'm right on that mark. So I'm going to dump that in to my dump. And I'm going to pour the last little bit of green in. So I have to get down because it's a very small amount. There we go. 0.1, 2, 3, 4. Well, actually, that's 5 because that's a bigger one. So it's 5, 6, 7. So I have 10.7 milliliters was in test tube D, so 10.7 milliliters. And make sure you're labeling the numbers you're putting in your data chart. I'm going to take test tube E. There's my 10 mark again. Get down. That is at exactly 10 again, guys. So I'm going to dump it into my dump. And just take the rest of E and pour it in. So that one was at 10. I'm at 11.1, 11.2 in person. So there's 11.2 milliliters in test tube E. We just have one more left to go, guys. Again, looking for that 10 milliliter mark. Not quite there yet. Oop, I'm just a little too far that time. Let's see if I can just get 1 or 2 drops out. Gonna get down. That one's gonna be super close, and that looks to be right on the 10 mark. So we just have a little bit left to measure. And if I get down, I am just shy of 1. I'm 2 notches away, so that means I am at 0.8. So I have 10.8 milliliters of water in test tube F. So if you're wondering if you wrote the right amounts down, take a look at my data chart. Now the last step is, if you did this at home, you're definitely going to want to clean up before you finish your lab report. Go through, make sure you rinse everything up, wipe off your counters so you don't ruin anything at home, and then you're going to come back and finish the conclusion. So in your own words, you're going to write what the purpose of this lab was, you're going to write what is volume, and then you're going to write about what you learned about working with small amounts of liquid volume in graduated cylinders. So you should be able to answer all those questions even if you were just following along with me. Once you have those all filled in, you can upload your lab report to Canvas. Thanks for following.